One of my unexpected enjoyments about motorcycle touring is meeting people, which I find a little bit perplexing as in general, people shit me. But every now and then I come across someone who doesn't, and it appears that the motorcycling community has a larger percentage of these rarities. One of these blokes is called Bruce.
Good day, Bruce.
Oh, hello, Bruce.
How are you, Bruce?
Bit crook, Bruce.
Where's Bruce?
It's not here, Bruce.
I met Bruce during one of the Thunderbird flockings, and I think it was his rebellious, couldn't give a fuck, I'll sleep anywhere I want, when I want attitude that appealed to me, as we probably both potentially embrace a similar reckless denial of sleep apnea. Well, anyway, long story short, he invited me to join the Tasmania ride he was organising the following year. And as it was on my bucket list, I jumped at the chance. But a few months into the planning, things started to go awry. The most notable being when Bruce called to inform me that a few people had dropped out and casually went on to mention that we'd probably be the only two motorcycles, with the rest being spiders. Huh? Spiders? That's the first time anyone mentioned anything about riding with fucking spiders. It's akin to someone setting you up with a good sort only to have them say when you're about to take them home, you know she's actually a bloke, right? As it sort of sits on your arse a bit, as it's probably something you would have preferred to have known up front. Oh, and another minor hiccup, closed borders due to COVID fucked up any chance we had of actually getting to Tasmania. But to keep the ride alive, Brewster changed it to the South Coast Tour, which had its bonuses as the closer distance and less time away meant the missus was now able to come along. The majority of the crew kicked off the ride from the Newcastle area on a Friday, with their destination being Jervis Bay. It was there while enjoying a beer on the deck of the Huskinson Hotel, a few of the old blokes were debating what kind of bird it was they could see floundering in the bay. Was it a swan? An albatross? A Norwegian blue? The last speculative effort was that it was a wood duck, before someone who wasn't a half-pissed silly old bastard with failing eyesight correctly identified the bird as a seal playfully drifting along on its side with its flipper in the air. This apparently suitably amused enough people to become a trip-defining moment, as from that point forward any slightly obscure question or observation was answered with a wood duck reference of some variety. Yeah, I don't know either, as I suppose you had to be there. And me and Trace weren't, as we didn't meet up with the ride until the next day in Braidwood. Now, I have to admit that me and Trace sort of sheepishly shuffled around next to our parked Thunderbirds as the spiders rolled into town, sort of hoping it wouldn't be too embarrassing. But it was worse than we ever could have imagined, as buried in the bunch was a bloody Harley. Now, I didn't panic. As most of the riders in this group were of a mature age, I thought maybe this bloke isn't your typical Harley rider. But after he cracked the throttle several times as he walked his bike backwards into his parking spot, I then thought, oh, maybe he is. With the bikes parked and helmets off, I was surprised to see a few familiar flocking faces. And others I had no idea if I'd met before or not, as I'm hopeless with faces and names. So after the smiles, nods, shaking of hands and awkward embraces, it was mount up for lunch at Bateman's Bay, then on to Narooma for a couple of nights. Now this turns out to be a trait of Bruce organised rides, as staying 2 nights instead of 1 really takes off the edge. It's surprising how much more relaxing it makes a trip not having to pack and unpack the bike each day. I highly recommend incorporating this into rides if you have the time, as there's always something to see, do or ride to, no matter where you've dropped stands. It also gave us time to get to know each other too, and I was surprisingly impressed. The spider riders actually appeared to be quite normal. To this point, not one of them had attempted to have sex with an animal that I was aware of, and at no point had the Harley rider yet to ask if anyone wanted to see his penis. No, but seriously, I don't think I've ridden with a better bunch of boys and girls, especially considering when we just met. They were all a bloody cack, and some even laughed at my jokes, which will win me over every time. Our day off in Narooma was a quiet one, with just a ride down the road to Budella so the girls could check out the hippie shop, while some of the more hardened bikies amongst us flexed their live-to-ride lifestyle and grabbed an ice cream at the Budella Dairy. This inspired another trip-defining moment. the telling of the penguin with car troubles joke. A penguin was driving down the road when his car started to play up, so he pulled into a garage. The mechanic said to leave it with him for a bit and he'd take a look at it. So the penguin waddled off to the shops to get something to eat. About half an hour later, the penguin waddled back to find the mechanic busy under the bonnet of his car. "How's it going?" asked the penguin. The mechanic glanced back and says, "Looks like you've blown a seal." "Fuck off," said the penguin, "I've been eating an ice cream." After howls of derisive laughter, Bruce, we were inspired to ride back to Narooma to see the seals at Australia Rock. So named because the rock has a hole in it that sort of looks like Australia, minus Tasmania. Bit like this trip. I did monitor this young lady for a while, climbing around the rock on the off chance she accidentally displayed her map of Tassie to complete the picture, but she managed to maintain her footing long enough for me to lose interest. Our next two-nighter was at Eden, where we stayed at the Whale Fisher Motel. Although the parking was on a bit of a slope with a generous layer of loose gravel, which made parking a bit tricky, the rooms were excellent and appeared very clean. That's until I found fucking whale cum on the wall above the kitchen sink. Ugh. On our day off in Eden, we were going to ride to Malakuta for lunch, but it turned out we still needed border passes and all that sort of shit. So instead we did the local touristy thing and went to the Eden Killer Whale Museum, which I've loved since it was a tin shack when I first visited as a kid on a school excursion back in the 70s. The museum is home to Old Tom, a killer whale who, when he was still kicking, was the leader of a pod of orcas who would herd passing baleen whales into Twofold Bay, then give the whalers ahoy, who would in turn launch their boats and slaughtered the herded whales. As a reward, the whalers would cut out the lips and tongues of the dead whales and chuck it to the orcas, who apparently thought it was the wood duck's guts. Inspired, we then rode out of town to check out Boyd's Tower, which is an old whaling lookout well worth a look at. The surrounding seascape is pretty spectacular too, but copped a bit of a flogging from last year's bushfires. Blokes who are blogging these days have got those drones. I haven't got one of those, but let's see how this works. Yeah, maybe not. The next day was the ride to Cooma. Flying in the face of the forecast, we had a dry run to Bombala along the Inlay Road. brekkie and recreating the 25-year-old photo of my old 900 Thunderbird out the front of the Olympia Theatre, we had the same brilliant riding conditions on the ride to Jindabyne via Dalgety and the Snowy River Way. After dropping my bike in front of an appreciative crowd at the Jindabyne Servo, we headed off to our next double overnighter, Cooma. Now, Bruce had booked us into the budget-friendly bunkhouse motel, which is bloody brilliant. Self-described as biker-friendly, they allowed us to park up in the courtyard so we could see our bikes from our rooms. Smack bang in the middle of town, the place has atmosphere and character. From the cranky old bitch abusing everybody who slammed the door near a room, to the piss bloke loudly sizing up our bikes on his mobile to his mate in the middle of the night. But honestly, the joint wouldn't win any prizes, but it was my favourite accommodation of the entire trip. Our spare day in Cooma had us ride just down the road to check out the leather shop in Nimitaville, plus next door for a coffee and the best homemade breakfast quiche I've ever had. So someone then decided it'd be a brilliant idea if we rode to the lookout at the top of Brown Mountain, and despite the black clouds in the distance, we pushed on. The bastards tricked us. Although we made it to the lookout with no dramas, the cumuli nimbus had outflanked us, and we got smashed by rain and hail on the ride back. But after a hot shower, a change of clothes and a top feed and service at Rosie's Lebanese restaurant, we were good to go. Back to bed. The next day was our ride to Cowra, and as I was the local, I was thrust into the role of road captain, something that's never gone real well for me. And it started as expected after I'd missed the first turns from leaving the motel, which had us scattered through the back streets of Cooma. And then, when we got to the highway, I tried to maintain a healthy pace so I wouldn't look like a pussy or something, and this left the group strung out for over a kilometre. This forced us to regroup in the Canberra suburb of Corwell, but then I successfully navigated us all to Burrawa via Timbindua Road, the Cotta, Uriara Crossing and then Yass. But Mountain Creek Road had taken its toll. On the way, Terry's wing mirror was left flapping around and Bruce had snapped a saddlebag bolt. We then stopped for a bloody beautiful lunch at the Burrawa Hotel, where I ran into old mate Yarny, who would have to have the best photo I reckon I've seen of a bloke enjoying a ride. And after that, I went with Bruce, who was getting his bolt off at Cork Girls Engineering, with the help of a young redditor bloke surprisingly called Red. The next stop was to be Cowra, and as half the group rode off in front of me, it became pretty apparent that I'd been sacked as road captain. Sulkily, I followed, dwelling on my newfound empathy for William Bligh. And this must have distracted me enough not to register why that silver BMW was reversed halfway up the goat track to the side of the road. And the subsequent display of his red and blue soon solved that little mystery. 123 in a 100 zone, you reckoned, which you probably couldn't argue with, but what I did query is why the fuck he picked me out of the middle of the pack. "Well, you're all speeding," he said, "but you were going fastest." How the fuck does that work? I even offered the names and addresses of everybody else, but the prick wasn't even interested in doing a deal. So I slowly rolled into the Crest Motel in Cowra to a round of applause from the gang as they settled in for our last night on the road, and even that was a great night in. We bought some takeaways and a few bevies, sat around in front of the rooms talking shit and having a laugh. Even one of the higher patrol who was staying at the motel popped over for a bit. Great crew, great fun, I'm really looking forward to the next one, guys.